I was there when the first visions came, 12 years old, and scrubbing deck plates in the belly of a merchant vessel. The taste of copper and ozone filled my mouth as images flooded my mind. The ship's death 3 hours before it happened. My name is Cale Thorne, and for the last 15 years, I have been living the greatest lie in the Imperium. I am a Psyker, an unsanctioned witch who should have been executed or dragged to the black ships the moment my powers manifested. Instead, I learned to hide, to suppress, to pretend I was nothing more than another faceless worker in humanity's endless machine. You think that makes me a coward, but you don't understand the alternative. You haven't felt the touch of the warp burning through your soul like acid. You haven't seen what happens to those who get caught. This is my confession, my warning, and perhaps my final testimony before the walls I've built around my mind finally crumble. Chapter 1. First Whispers. The taste of recycled air and machine oil was all I'd ever known aboard the merchant vessel, Profitable Venture. But that morning in Sector 7 Delta, something else crept into my awareness. Something that tasted like lightning and smelled like burnt copper. I was 12 years old, small enough to crawl through the maintenance shafts that connected the ship's atmospheric recyclers, armed with nothing but a sanctified wrench, and the deep certainty that my life would never amount to more than indentured servitude. My mother had sold my labor contract to Captain Vex before my 8th birthday, desperate for enough credits to feed my younger sister through another winter on Mordian 7. 4 years later, I could barely remember her face. But I remembered the weight of her hand on my shoulder as she explained why I had to go. The ship needed deck workers, maintenance crew, children small enough to reach places that adult hands couldn't access. The Emperor provides, she'd whispered, the standard blessing of the desperate. Serve faithfully, and perhaps you'll earn enough to buy passage home. Home felt like a concept from another lifetime as I wormed through a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for my shoulders, following the schematic on my data slate toward a recycler unit that had been malfunctioning for 3 days. The ship's atmosphere was growing stale, carbon dioxide levels creeping toward dangerous parameters, while Captain Vex delayed hiring proper tech adepts who might actually fix the problem. Cheaper to risk a child's life than pay guild rates. I'd learned not to think too hard about the economics of indentured labor. The contracts were legal, sanctioned by imperial law, blessed by the ecclesiarchy as proper stewardship of human resources. Children worked until their contracts expired, or they died, whichever came first. The lucky ones lived long enough to become full crew members. The unlucky ones became statistics in maintenance logs. The recycler unit sat in a chamber barely large enough for a grown man to stand upright, its machine spirit apparently suffering from some form of technical malaise that made it produce more heat than breathable air. I squeezed through the access panel and began the diagnostic ritual I'd performed hundreds of times before, checking connections, replacing worn components, offering the proper prayers to machine spirits that seemed increasingly unresponsive to human supplication. That's when the visions started. At first, I thought it was oxygen deprivation. The recycler chamber was hot, poorly ventilated, filled with chemical vapors that made your head swim if you breathed them too long. But the images flooding my mind were too vivid, too specific, too frighteningly detailed to be simple hallucinations. I saw the Profitable Venture 3 hours in the future, its hull split open like rotten fruit. Emergency klaxons screaming while atmosphere vented into space through wounds that couldn't be sealed. Bodies floating in corridors I'd walked through that very morning, their faces blue with asphyxiation and terror. I saw Captain Vex in his private quarters, frantically trying to reach the escape pods, while automated systems locked him out of his own ship. I saw the engine room, its plasma containment failing in cascade patterns that would make the fusion reactor into a miniature star. Most terrifying of all, I saw myself floating in the wreckage, my small body twisted into impossible angles by explosive decompression. The vision lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but when it ended, I was lying on the deck plates vomiting recycled protein paste, while my entire nervous system felt like it had been dipped in acid. Every nerve ending screamed with phantom pain, while my brain struggled to process sensory input that couldn't possibly be real. But it felt real. More real than the deck plates beneath my knees or the taste of vomit in my mouth. The vision carried certainty that transcended normal perception. Knowledge delivered with the weight of absolute truth. I was going to die in 3 hours unless something changed. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by 4 years of mechanical work and technical education, insisted that the experience was nothing more than stress-induced hallucination. People didn't see the future. Physics didn't work that way. The only beings capable of perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously were Psykers, and Psykers were abominations who deserved immediate execution for the safety of humanity. But rational thought couldn't explain the knowledge burning in my mind like a physical presence. I knew exactly what would cause the hull breach. A micrometeorite traveling at 17% the speed of light, too small for the ship's sensors to detect, but massive enough to punch through armor plating like tissue paper. I knew precisely where it would strike, what systems it would damage, how the cascading failures would spread through the ship's infrastructure. Most disturbing of all, I knew that conventional countermeasures wouldn't be sufficient to prevent the disaster. The meteorite was already too close, traveling too fast, aimed with mathematical precision at the ship's most vulnerable structural point. Unless someone made changes that conventional wisdom said were impossible. I spent the next hour in the recycler chamber, ostensibly performing routine maintenance, while actually using enhanced perception that shouldn't have existed to examine the ship's structural integrity in ways that transcended normal engineering knowledge. The information flowing through my consciousness included stress analysis, metallurgy reports, and predictive modeling that would have challenged a tech adept with decades of experience. The hull breach would occur at Junction 77 Alpha, where a previous repair had created a weak point in the ship's skeletal framework. The meteorite would strike at precisely 14:27 ship time, its impact transmitting shockwaves that would propagate through the superstructure until containment fields failed and atmosphere began venting. But if someone were to reinforce that junction with additional bracing, and if the ship's course could be altered by exactly 0.3 degrees, and if the fusion reactor's output could be reduced by 7% to prevent cascade failure, the disaster could be prevented. Lives could be saved, including my own. I crawled through maintenance shafts with purpose that transcended mere survival instinct, following routes that led to critical system access points throughout the ship. In each location, I made small adjustments that would appear to be routine maintenance to casual observation, but would actually implement the disaster prevention protocol burning in my mind. Structural bracing installed at Junction 77 Alpha. Navigation computers adjusted through maintenance interfaces that I shouldn't have known how to access. Reactor output modified through techniques that certainly weren't included in standard training manuals. By 13:30 ship time, I had finished implementing countermeasures that conventional engineering said should be impossible for a 12-year-old indentured laborer to conceive, much less execute. The modifications were subtle enough to avoid detection during routine inspections, but comprehensive enough to prevent the catastrophic failure that had been mathematically inevitable. At 14:27 ship time, nothing happened. No hull breach, no emergency klaxons, no explosive decompression that would have killed everyone aboard the profitable venture. The ship continued on its scheduled course toward the Segmentum Solar, its passengers and crew unaware that they had been moments away from violent death. I spent that evening in my assigned sleeping alcove, staring at the bulkhead while trying to process what I had experienced. The rational explanation was coincidence. Stress-induced hallucination, followed by routine maintenance that coincidentally prevented a disaster that might never have occurred anyway. But deep in my mind, in places that normal consciousness couldn't access, knowledge burned with the intensity of revealed truth. I had seen the future. I had changed it. I had used abilities that marked me as an abomination in the eyes of imperial law. I was a Psyker. The realization should have driven me to confess immediately, to report myself to the ship's authorities, and accept whatever punishment the Emperor's justice demanded. Psykers who remained unsanctioned posed existential threats to humanity, their uncontrolled abilities capable of opening rifts that would allow demons to enter real space. But I was 12 years old, terrified, and completely alone in a universe that would kill me without hesitation if it learned what I was becoming. Instead of confession, I chose concealment. Instead of accepting death, I chose to learn how to hide. That decision would define the next 15 years of my life, turning existence into an elaborate performance where every moment required perfect control over abilities that grew stronger with each passing day. I would become an expert at suppression, at misdirection, at pretending to be normal while forces that could reshape reality burned beneath my skin. The first lesson was simple. Power without control was suicide. The second lesson was harder. Control without purpose was merely prolonged dying. But those lessons lay ahead of me, hidden in a future I couldn't yet perceive. That night, I simply lay in darkness and listened to the ship's mechanical heartbeat, grateful to be alive while terrified of what I was becoming. Outside my porthole, the void stretched toward infinity, filled with threats that normal humans couldn't imagine. But the greatest threat wasn't among the stars. It was sleeping in a maintenance worker's alcove, dreaming dreams that showed tomorrow's disasters with perfect clarity. Chapter 2. Growing Shadows. 6 months after the first vision, the whispers had become voices, and the voices were becoming harder to ignore. I learned to function with a constant mental chorus that included fragments of conversation from across the ship, emotional resonances from crew members I'd never met, and occasionally, terrifyingly, thoughts that definitely weren't human. The profitable venture had joined a merchant convoy traveling through sectors where Imperial control was theoretical rather than practical. Pirate raids, equipment failures, and simple navigational errors killed ships with depressing regularity in the void between established trade routes. Our convoy consisted of 17 vessels, carrying everything from agricultural products to manufactured goods, protected by 2 elderly Imperial Navy escorts whose crews looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. I'd grown 3 inches and gained 20 pounds since my 12th birthday, no longer small enough to crawl through the smallest maintenance shafts, but still young enough to be assigned the most dangerous repair work. My official designation remained indentured labourer, technical maintenance, but my actual responsibilities had expanded to include anything too hazardous for valuable crew members. The psychic abilities that had saved the ship during the meteorite incident continued developing whether I wanted them to or not. Each day brought new manifestations that required increasingly sophisticated concealment techniques. Precognitive flashes showed me accidents minutes before they occurred. Telepathic sensitivity let me hear thoughts from across the ship. Most disturbing of all, telekinetic impulses made tools move when my emotions ran too high. I learned to hide the abilities through a combination of misdirection and deliberate ignorance. When precognitive visions warned me about equipment failures, I would discover the problems during routine maintenance and report them through proper channels. When telepathic eavesdropping revealed security threats, I would arrange for authorities to notice evidence that led them to the same conclusions. The key was making sure that my interventions appeared to be products of diligence and luck rather than supernatural awareness. But some situations couldn't be handled through subtle manipulation. The convoy was 3 weeks out from Mordian's 7th when pirates struck our formation with coordinated precision that suggested inside knowledge of our cargo, manifests, and defensive capabilities. The attack began at 0347 ship time with the sudden disappearance of our starboard escort, the frigate Righteous Fury vanishing from sensor screens without distress calls or debris fields. I was performing night maintenance in the plasma conduit network when the first boarding torpedoes struck our hull. The impact threw me against bulkhead plating with enough force to crack 2 ribs, while emergency lighting bathed everything in crimson shadows that made the familiar corridors look like arteries in some vast organism. But physical pain was nothing compared to the psychic assault that accompanied the pirate attack. The boarding parties included beings that weren't entirely human, their minds radiating malevolence that felt like acid poured directly onto exposed nerves. Through unwanted telepathic contact, I experienced fragments of their thoughts, memories of worlds burned for pleasure, populations enslaved for profit, Children used as ammunition in weapons too horrible to imagine. These weren't ordinary pirates seeking easily liquidated cargo. They were chaos cultists, whose raids served purposes that transcended mere material gain. They were here to harvest something more valuable than trade goods. They were here to collect psychers. The revelation hit me like a physical blow as I realized that our convoy's route had been compromised by someone who knew exactly what cargo the merchant ships were carrying. The profitable venture wasn't transporting agricultural products and manufactured goods. Hidden in specially shielded cargo holds were 17 unsanctioned psychers being transported to a black ship rendezvous point. The pirates weren't here for conventional plunder. They were here to steal Imperial property that could be converted into demon hosts, chaos sorcerers, or raw material for rituals that would make entire star systems scream. I should have hidden in the deepest maintenance shafts and waited for the raid to pass. I should have protected my secret by remaining invisible while others fought and died around me. But telepathic contact with the raiders' minds had shown me exactly what they planned to do with their captives, and some forms of knowledge carry moral obligations that transcend personal survival. The cargo hold containing the Psyker prisoners was located in Section 4, 3 decks below my current position and protected by security systems designed to contain beings whose abilities could threaten reality itself. Getting there would require navigating through combat zones while avoiding both pirates and ship security personnel who might shoot first and identify targets later. But I had advantages that normal crew members lacked. Precognitive flashes showed me safe routes through corridors that would be filled with laser fire moments later. Telepathic awareness revealed the locations and intentions of hostile forces throughout the ship. Most importantly, telekinetic abilities could manipulate door controls, emergency systems, and weapon mechanisms from distances that kept me out of direct confrontation. I moved through the ship like a ghost, using enhanced perception to avoid encounters that would have been fatal for someone relying on normal human senses. When pirates rounded corners, I was already gone. When security teams swept areas, I was hiding in locations they'd already checked. The cargo hold was a heavily fortified chamber that looked more like a prison than a storage facility. 17 cells lined the walls, each containing a psyker whose abilities had been suppressed through a combination of drugs, psychic dampeners, and conditioning that left them barely conscious. The prisoners ranged in age from perhaps 8 years old to elderly adults whose sanity had been shattered by prolonged exposure to warp energies. All of them would die horribly if the pirates succeeded in their mission. The security systems protecting the cargo hold were designed to resist both physical assault and psychic manipulation. But they hadn't been designed to resist a psyker who could perceive their control protocols through enhanced awareness while manipulating their mechanisms through telekinetic precision. I disabled the containment fields one by one, using abilities that grew stronger with each successful application, while praying that the effort would undetract attention from forces that monitored psychic activity throughout the ship. Each liberated prisoner represented both a tactical asset and a potential catastrophe. Their combined abilities could repel the pirate assault, but they could also tear the ship apart if they lost control. The oldest prisoner was a woman whose eyes held depths that spoke of communion with forces beyond human comprehension. When I released her containment field, she looked at me with recognition that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. "You're the one they didn't catch," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "The hidden psyker who thinks he can save us all." "I'm trying to prevent a massacre," I replied, moving to the next cell while monitoring the tactical situation through enhanced awareness. "The pirates aren't here for cargo, they're here for you." "And what makes you think we want to be saved?" she asked, her question carrying implications that made my skin crawl. "What makes you think freedom is preferable to controlled captivity?" Before I could respond, the cargo hold's main entrance exploded inward in a shower of superheated metal and chemical smoke. The first pirate through the breach wore armor that seemed to absorb light while radiating malevolence that made normal perception impossible. Behind him came others whose forms shifted between human and something else, their weapons firing ammunition that screamed as it traveled. The liberated Psykers responded with abilities that turned the cargo hold into a battlefield, where normal physics provided only rough guidelines for what was possible. Telekinetic forces hurled attackers against bulkheads with bone-crushing impact. Pyrokinetic manifestations filled the air with flames that burned in colors that shouldn't exist. Most terrifying of all, one of the younger prisoners began altering local reality through what could only be described as weaponized imagination. I found myself caught in the crossfire between beings whose conflicts operated on scales that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes in objective time, but subjective experience stretched those minutes into hours of sensory overload that left permanent marks on my perception. When the fighting ended, 12 pirates lay dead in positions that suggested they'd been killed by forces that operated outside conventional causality. The 5 surviving Psykers stood among the wreckage like avatars of cosmic indifference, their liberation having cost them whatever humanity they'd retained during captivity. "You freed us," the elderly woman said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate in unnatural patterns. "Now you must choose what that freedom means." The choice she offered wasn't between life and death, but between continued concealment and open acknowledgement of what I was becoming. The abilities I'd used to liberate the prisoners had marked me as clearly as if I'd painted targets on my forehead. Every psychic sensitive being within light years would now know that something had awakened aboard the profitable venture, including entities that served powers far more dangerous than simple pirates. I chose concealment, but concealment had become a facade that grew thinner with each passing day. The whispers in my mind were becoming demands. The voices were becoming commands. And somewhere in the warp, intelligences that fed on psychic energy had begun to notice the feast that was slowly preparing itself. The real danger wasn't discovery by imperial authorities. The real danger was discovery by things that were infinitely worse. Chapter 3. Breaking Points. 2 years passed before I learned that hiding from the Imperium was the least of my concerns. The real predators hunting unsanctioned Psykers didn't wear Inquisition rosettes or sail in black ships painted with holy symbols. They dwelt in dimensions where human concepts of space and time were merely suggestions, and they were patient in ways that transcended mortal understanding. I was 14 when the nightmares began, and 17 when I realized they weren't nightmares at all. The profitable venture had been reassigned to exploration duties in the Eastern Fringe, mapping trade routes through systems where imperial control existed more in theory than practice. The work was dangerous enough that Captain Vex could justify hiring real technical specialists, which meant my responsibilities shifted from life-threatening maintenance to merely hazardous cargo handling. The promotion came with a private cabin barely larger than a storage closet, but privacy was worth more than space to someone who spent every waking moment maintaining psychological barriers that prevented telepathic spillover from affecting the crew. Living alone meant I could practice the meditation techniques that kept unwanted thoughts from broadcasting across the ship. It also meant there were no witnesses when the entities began visiting. The first manifestation occurred during the Deep Watch, when ship's night cycle reduced activity to essential systems monitoring, and the skeleton crew needed to keep 17,000 tons of metal moving through the void. I was lying in my bunk reviewing technical manuals on a data slate when the temperature in my cabin dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Breath misted in air that had been perfectly climate-controlled moments before, while emergency lighting flickered in patterns that suggested electromagnetic interference from unknown sources. The data slate screen developed static that resolved into images that couldn't have existed in its memory banks. Landscapes of crystalline towers under impossible skies, beings of living geometry that moved through dimensions that hurt to contemplate directly. But the images were nothing compared to the presence that accompanied them. Something vast and alien pressed against the barriers I'd built around my mind, testing their strength with curiosity that felt like surgical instruments probing for weak points. The contact lasted perhaps 30 seconds before withdrawing, leaving behind sensations that lingered for hours, like the taste of metal and the smell of burnt offerings. I told myself it was stress-induced hallucination, the product of maintaining psychic suppression for 5 years without proper training or guidance. Unsanctioned psychers who attempted self-discipline frequently suffered psychological breakdowns that manifested as apparent supernatural contact. But the visits continued with increasing frequency and intensity, each encounter providing clearer evidence that something was attempting systematic infiltration of my consciousness. The entities, I eventually realized, weren't random manifestations of psychic overflow. They were intelligent beings conducting reconnaissance for purposes that normal human cognition couldn't encompass. Through fragmentary mental contact, I glimpsed aspects of their nature that no sane person should ever perceive. They were servants of powers that existed before humanity achieved sentience, beings whose reality operated according to principles that made conventional physics look like children's games. They fed on psychic energy, emotion, and suffering, converting sentient consciousness into forms of sustenance that could maintain their existence in real space. Most disturbing of all, they were drawn to unsanctioned psychers, like predators following scent trails through forests. Every use of psychic abilities created resonances that propagated through the warp, advertising the presence of unprotected minds to entities that regarded human consciousness as particularly appetizing prey. I had been painting targets on myself for 5 years without realizing it. The revelation should have driven me to immediate confession, seeking protection from imperial authorities who at least had experience dealing with supernatural threats. But confession would have meant execution or worse, transformation into the kind of sanctioned psyker whose existence was measured in years of agony before inevitable madness claimed whatever remained of their humanity. Instead, I chose a third option that was either brilliantly innovative or suicidally stupid. I decided to learn how to fight back. The ship's library contained extensive files on xenobiology, theoretical physics, and historical accounts of humanity's expansion into space. Hidden among routine technical documentation were references to phenomena that orthodox imperial doctrine preferred not to acknowledge: psychic entities, dimensional incursions, and techniques for combating threats that existed outside normal reality. I became an expert on subjects that weren't supposed to exist, studying predators that hunted across dimensions while developing countermeasures that combined scientific methodology with principles that transcended conventional materialism. The research took months, conducted during off-duty hours when I could access library terminals without attracting attention from crew members who might wonder why a cargo handler was reading theoretical papers on warp physics. The breakthrough came when I discovered references to something called psychic anchoring, techniques used by unsanctioned psychers to resist supernatural predation through controlled use of the same abilities that made them vulnerable in the first place. The method involved creating mental constructs that served as barriers between human consciousness and warp entities, using focused willpower to maintain stability in the face of forces that sought to dissolve individual identity. But the technique required controlled application of psychic abilities, which meant abandoning the suppression strategies that had kept me hidden for years. I would have to use my powers openly while hoping that defensive applications would be less detectable than offensive manifestations. The first experiment nearly killed me. I was alone in my cabin during the deep watch, attempting to construct mental barriers using telekinetic principles adapted for psychological defense. The process required visualizing protective structures while using willpower to give them substance in dimensions that existed parallel to normal space. The effort was like trying to build walls out of thought itself, each mental brick requiring conscious effort to maintain, while the overall structure demanded architectural planning that challenged human cognitive capacity. But after hours of concentration that left me physically exhausted and psychologically drained, I managed to create something that resembled a fortress built from crystallized intention. The entities noticed immediately. What had been subtle infiltration attempts became active assault as beings whose existence transcended physical limitations threw themselves against barriers that shouldn't have been possible for human consciousness to construct. The attack lasted subjective hours while occupying objective minutes, reality becoming fluid as conflicting forces sought to impose incompatible definitions of what was possible. Through the mental contact involved in psychic combat, I experienced fragments of my attacker's nature that revealed truths about the universe that no human being should ever learn. The galaxy was infested with intelligences that regarded material reality as merely one domain among many, creatures whose power made the Emperor's might look like candle flames compared to stellar fires. But human consciousness possessed qualities that made it uniquely suited for resistance to supernatural predation. Individual will, properly focused and defended, could create zones of stability that even cosmic entities found difficult to penetrate. The key was learning to use psychic abilities as tools for construction rather than destruction, building barriers instead of weapons. The battle ended when my improvised defenses finally repelled the assault, sending the entities retreating to whatever dimensions they'd emerged from. But victory came at a cost that would haunt me for years. The knowledge that I was now actively engaged in a war that would continue until either I learned to fight more effectively or the predators found ways to bypass my defenses. The next morning, I woke to discover that my hair had turned white overnight, and my eyes had developed flecks of silver that caught light in ways that normal human vision shouldn't permit. The changes were subtle enough to escape casual notice, but anyone with training in recognizing psychic manifestations would identify me as an unsanctioned witch within moments. I learned to use cosmetic treatments that disguise the physical alterations while developing more sophisticated concealment techniques that could hide psychic emanations from detection equipment. But concealment was becoming a performance that required constant attention, every moment demanding perfect control over abilities that grew stronger with each defensive application. The war against supernatural predators continued throughout my 17th year, each encounter teaching me new techniques while revealing fresh aspects of the cosmic horror that surrounded human civilization. I learned to fight beings made of living mathematics, entities that existed as viral ideas capable of rewriting reality through conceptual infection, and predators whose hunger could devour entire planets if left unchecked. But the most dangerous enemy wasn't among the entities that attacked from outside dimensions. The most dangerous enemy was the growing realization that I was becoming something that no longer qualified as entirely human. Each psychic battle left marks that accumulated over time, changing not just my appearance, but fundamental aspects of consciousness itself. My thoughts began operating in patterns that normal human cognition couldn't sustain. My perception encompassed layers of reality that baseline humans couldn't access. Most troubling of all, my emotional responses started shifting toward cosmic indifference that made individual suffering seem insignificant compared to universal patterns. I was winning the war against supernatural predation by becoming something that might be worse than the predators themselves. The realization forced me to confront questions that had no comfortable answers. Was humanity worth preserving if preservation required abandoning essential human characteristics? Could individual freedom justify risks that might damn entire populations? Was there any meaningful difference between choosing damnation and having damnation chosen for you? The answers, when they came, would reshape not just my own existence, but the fate of everyone aboard the profitable venture. Because supernatural predators weren't the only forces that had been monitoring my psychic development. Imperial authorities had finally taken notice of the anomalies surrounding our ship, and they were sending investigators whose methods made demon hunting look humane by comparison. Chapter 4. The Inquisition arrives. The Inquisition ship Eternal Vigilance translated from warp space without warning on a Tuesday that started like any other day in the void. I was calibrating atmospheric recyclers in Section 7 when every psychic sense I'd developed over 5 years screamed warnings that made my teeth ache and my vision blur with phantom colors. Something was wrong. Something vast and implacably hostile was approaching the profitable venture with intentions that would end very badly for anyone whose existence deviated from imperial orthodoxy in any measurable way. Through unwanted telepathic contact with crew members throughout the ship, I experienced the moment when Captain Vex received the transmission that would change everything. The message was brief, formal, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Imperial vessel Profitable Venture, you will heave to and prepare for boarding. By authority of His Most Holy Inquisition, this ship and all souls aboard are subject to immediate investigation. Resistance will be met with total obliteration. No explanation. No specific charges. No indication of what had drawn inquisitorial attention to a routine merchant vessel operating in sectors where imperial authority was largely theoretical. Just the cold certainty that some of the most dangerous human beings in the galaxy were about to examine our ship with instruments that could detect heresy in its most subtle forms. I had perhaps 30 minutes before the boarding parties arrived. 30 minutes to decide whether to run, hide, or attempt some form of resistance that would probably result in everyone aboard dying messily. The smart choice was obviously to find the deepest, most isolated corner of the ship and hope that superior concealment techniques would keep me invisible during whatever investigation the Inquisition had planned. But 30 minutes also gave me time to use enhanced perception to examine the approaching ship in ways that normal sensors couldn't match, and what I discovered was worse than simple heresy investigation. The Eternal Vigilance wasn't conducting routine compliance monitoring. It was a specialized vessel designed specifically for hunting unsanctioned Psykers, equipped with detection equipment that could identify psychic emanations across interplanetary distances. More disturbing were the beings aboard that ship, not just inquisitors and their retinues, but sanctioned Psykers, whose abilities had been weaponized for purposes that made conventional warfare look humane. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they'd found it. Through precognitive flashes that showed fragments of possible futures, I glimpsed what would happen during the next few hours. Interrogation techniques that made torture look like gentle persuasion. Psychic probes that could rip memories directly from human consciousness. Most terrifying of all, sanctioned Psykers whose job was identifying concealed heretics through methods that violated everything decent about human existence. But the visions also showed me something else. Opportunities for intervention that might save not just my own life, but the lives of everyone aboard the profitable venture. The Inquisition's investigative protocols followed predictable patterns that enhanced awareness could anticipate and, potentially, manipulate. The key was making sure they found exactly what they expected to find, while ensuring that what they found wouldn't implicate anyone whose only crime was proximity to forces beyond their control. I spent the next 20 minutes moving through the ship like a ghost with a purpose, using telekinetic abilities to plant evidence that would satisfy inquisitorial expectations while misdirecting attention away from my actual location. Subtle traces of psychic emanation, carefully placed to suggest the presence of an unsanctioned witch who'd been using the ship as transportation between systems. The fabricated evidence told a story that contained just enough truth to be believable. An untrained Psyker had somehow infiltrated the crew, using crude abilities to avoid detection while gradually succumbing to supernatural corruption. The psychic traces I left behind suggested someone whose powers were growing beyond their ability to control, making them a legitimate threat to Imperial security. But the trail led to Cargo Hold 17, where a carefully constructed psychic resonance would convince investigators that their target had been present recently but was no longer aboard the ship. The implication would be that the heretic had fled during the ship's last port call, leaving behind only traces that confirmed the Inquisition's suspicions without providing actual targets for their attention. It was elaborate misdirection that required precise application of abilities I'd spent years learning to hide. But misdirection was preferable to the alternatives that precognitive visions had shown me. The boarding parties arrived with mechanical precision that spoke of thousands of similar operations conducted across the galaxy. 20 inquisitorial stormtroopers in power armor that bristled with equipment designed to detect and neutralize supernatural threats. Behind them came tech adepts whose instruments could analyze psychic residue with laboratory precision. And behind them came the most dangerous member of the investigative team, Inquisitor Vex, a woman whose presence made reality itself seem unstable in ways that normal perception couldn't process. I watched the investigation through hidden surveillance equipment while maintaining complete psychic silence, every mental barrier reinforced to prevent any emanation that might reveal my location. The Inquisitor moved through the ship like a predator following scent trails, her enhanced sensors detecting traces of supernatural activity that conventional instruments would miss entirely. She was good, better than good. She was possibly the most skilled heretic hunter I'd ever encountered, even through second-hand observation. Her investigation techniques combined scientific methodology with intuitive leaps that suggested extensive experience tracking beings who could manipulate reality through willpower alone. But she was also constrained by the same assumptions that limited all imperial authorities. The belief that unsanctioned psychers were necessarily weak, untrained, and prone to making mistakes that would expose them to detection. The evidence I'd planted confirmed those assumptions, while leading her away from the carefully concealed truth of what I'd become. The investigation reached cargo hold, 17 after 3 hours of systematic searching that had reduced the crew to terrified compliance. I felt Inquisitor Vex's presence like a weight pressing against my consciousness as she examined the psychic traces I'd left behind. Her enhanced senses reading the fabricated story with precision that would have been admirable under different circumstances. "Astropath Kellyan," she commanded, her voice carrying authority that made the air itself seem to solidify. Analysis. The sanctioned Psyker who accompanied her was a broken thing whose humanity had been surgically removed to make room for abilities that served Imperial interests. Through unwanted telepathic contact, I experienced fragments of his consciousness, decades of agony, systematic brutalization, and conditioning that had transformed a human being into a living weapon whose only purpose was hunting others like himself. His psychic examination of the cargo hold was thorough, professional, and ultimately successful in exactly the way I'd intended. The traces I'd planted told him a story that matched inquisitorial expectations. An untrained witch whose abilities had grown beyond concealment. Someone who'd used the ship as transportation before fleeing to avoid capture. "The heretic was here recently," Astropath Kellyan reported, his voice carrying harmonics that made normal hearing impossible. "Untrained, desperate, probably dying from psychic overload. The trail leads to the docking bay, suggesting escape during our last port call." Inquisitor Vex accepted the assessment with satisfaction that felt like razors dragged across exposed nerves. The investigation had confirmed her suspicions while providing clear evidence that the threat had already been neutralized through natural causes or voluntary departure. "Seal this compartment," she ordered. "Standard purification protocols. If any trace of corruption remains, I want it burned out with blessed promethium." The cleansing ritual that followed was thorough, brutal, and exactly what I'd anticipated when planting the evidence. Everything in cargo hold 17 was destroyed through application of fire and prayer, eliminating any possibility that residual psychic emanations might contradict the story that had satisfied inquisitorial investigation. But the ritual also served another purpose that the Inquisitor couldn't have intended. It destroyed the last traces of my actual psychic signature that might have remained in that section of the ship. The purification that was meant to eliminate heretical corruption also eliminated evidence of abilities that transcended anything the investigation had been designed to detect. The Eternal Vigilance departed 6 hours after arriving, its crew satisfied that they'd identified and neutralized a potential threat to Imperial security. Captain Vex received commendation for his cooperation, while the crew was blessed with purification rites that would protect them from any lingering supernatural taint. I remained hidden in maintenance shafts during the departure, listening to conversations that revealed how close the investigation had come to discovering the truth. Several crew members had reported unusual incidents that might have implicated me if the investigators had been looking for more sophisticated concealment techniques. But Imperial doctrine made assumptions about unsanctioned psychers that had worked in my favor, that we were weak, untrained, prone to mistakes that would reveal our nature to anyone with proper equipment. The Inquisition had found exactly what they'd expected to find, which prevented them from looking for evidence of abilities that transcended their operational parameters. The investigation's success taught me important lessons about concealment that would serve me well in years to come. The key wasn't perfect invisibility. That was impossible for anyone using psychic abilities on a regular basis. The key was controlled visibility that satisfied authority expectations while misdirecting attention away from capabilities that fell outside normal classification systems. but the encounter also revealed how much I'd changed during 5 years of hiding from forces that hunted people like me. The person who'd planted evidence for inquisitorial investigation was no longer the terrified child who'd first experienced precognitive visions. I'd become something capable of manipulating some of the most dangerous human beings in the galaxy, using their own expertise against them with precision that suggested abilities far beyond simple psychic sensitivity. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. I was winning the game of concealment, but victory was changing me into something that might no longer qualify as recognizably human. And somewhere in the warp, entities that fed on psychic energy had noticed that their prey was becoming something much more interesting than simple food. The real war was just beginning. Chapter 5. Deepest Hungers. By my 19th birthday, I'd learned that the warp contained predators whose hunger made mortal concepts of evil look like philosophical exercises. They gathered around unsanctioned psychers like scavengers around carrion, drawn by psychic emanations that advertised the presence of consciousness, unconstrained by imperial protections. But I'd also learned that hunger could be weaponized against those who felt it. The profitable venture had been assigned to exploration duties in the Ghoul Stars, mapping systems where human presence was measured in archaeological remnants rather than living populations. The work was dangerous enough to justify hazard pay that attracted crew members who'd exhausted more conventional employment opportunities, creating a ship's complement that included former Imperial Guard deserters, ex-gang members, and individuals whose backgrounds didn't survive careful scrutiny. Perfect cover for someone whose existence violated fundamental Imperial law. My official position had evolved to Technical Specialist Third Class, which meant responsibility for maintaining systems too complex for ordinary crew members, but not important enough to justify hiring certified tech adepts. The work provided access to ship's records, sensor data, and communication systems that most crew members never saw. It also provided opportunities to monitor the supernatural predators that had been stalking me for 7 years. The entities hunting unsanctioned psychers operated according to patterns that enhanced awareness could detect and analyze. They gathered around ships carrying psychic individuals, fed on emotional emanations produced by fear and desperation, and struck when their prey was isolated from potential assistance. But their behavior followed rules that suggested intelligence rather than simple hunger, making them vulnerable to tactics that used their own nature against them. I'd been studying my predators for 3 years, learning their habits while developing countermeasures that went far beyond simple defense. The research had taught me that supernatural entities were neither omnipotent nor invulnerable. They were simply operating according to principles that human understanding couldn't easily encompass. But principles could be learned, and learned principles could be exploited. The first coordinated attack came during the Deep Watch, when ship's night cycle reduced crew activity to essential monitoring and skeleton crews. I was alone in the secondary computer core, ostensibly performing routine maintenance while actually using enhanced perception to track supernatural movement through dimensions that existed parallel to normal space. 7 entities had gathered around the profitable venture, their presence creating distortions that made local reality unstable in ways that conventional sensors couldn't detect. Through unwanted telepathic contact, I experienced fragments of their nature, beings whose existence transcended physical limitations, creatures that fed on psychic energy while converting human consciousness into forms of sustenance that could maintain their presence in real space. They'd been following the ship for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to strike when their target was isolated from potential interference. Tonight, they'd decided, was perfect for harvesting the unsanctioned Psyker whose emanations had been advertising his presence across interstellar distances. They were right about the isolation. They were wrong about everything else. The assault began with reality becoming fluid around the computer core, dimensions shifting in ways that made normal geometry impossible to maintain. Walls developed angles that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. Gravity rotated through orientations that human inner ears couldn't process. Most disturbing of all, time began operating according to principles that made causality into a suggestion rather than a law. Through the dimensional distortion, The entities manifested as beings whose forms challenged human perception. Living geometries that moved through space by redefining what space meant. Creatures of crystallized hunger whose very presence converted matter into forms that could satisfy appetites, transcending material consumption. Intelligences so alien that contact with them required abandoning fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. They expected terror. They expected desperate resistance followed by inevitable surrender. They expected to feed on psychic energy while converting their prey into raw material for rituals that would strengthen their presence in real space. Instead, they encountered something that had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. The psychic barriers I'd constructed weren't simple defensive fortifications. They were elaborate traps designed to exploit the predator's own nature against them, using their hunger as a weapon that could be turned back on its source. Each entity that pressed against my defenses encountered not resistance, but carefully crafted lures that promised exactly the kind of psychic energy they craved most. But the lures were poisoned. Instead of feeding on human consciousness, the entities found themselves consuming constructs that had been designed to damage anything that tried to digest them. Psychic energy that carried viral patterns capable of rewriting alien thought processes. Emotional emanations that contained logical paradoxes designed to create recursive loops in non-human cognition. Most devastating of all, memories that included experiences so fundamentally human that alien consciousness couldn't process them without suffering conceptual damage. The battle lasted subjective hours while occupying objective minutes, reality reshaping itself repeatedly as conflicting forces sought to impose incompatible definitions of what was possible. Through psychic contact with my attackers, I experienced the war from perspectives that no human being should ever access, viewpoints that encompassed multiple dimensions simultaneously, thought processes that operated according to mathematics that violated fundamental laws of logic. But I also experienced something else. The moment when cosmic predators realized that their prey had become something capable of hunting them back. The first entity to fall was a creature of living hunger, whose existence was predicated on consuming consciousness from beings incapable of resistance. When it encountered psychic energy that fought back through methods that transcended its understanding, the resultant feedback loop created paradoxes that caused its fundamental nature to collapse in on itself. The second fell to logical viruses that rewrote its thought processes according to human patterns of causality, transforming a being of cosmic indifference into something that experienced individual mortality with all the terror that implied. The remaining 5 attempted to retreat when they realized that continued assault would result in their own destruction, but retreat required returning to dimensions where they could exist safely. I'd been blocking those pathways for the past 3 years, using techniques that normal human consciousness shouldn't have been able to conceive. They were trapped in real space, with a predator whose capabilities transcended their ability to classify or counter. The slaughter that followed was systematic, brutal, and absolutely necessary for reasons that extended far beyond personal survival. Each entity I destroyed sent resonance patterns through the warp that would warn others of their kind about the dangers involved in hunting this particular unsanctioned Psyker. But killing supernatural predators also marked me in ways that no amount of concealment could hide from beings with sufficient sensitivity to detect the signatures that such actions left behind. I'd won a victory that guaranteed future conflicts would involve adversaries far more dangerous than simple hunger made manifest. When the battle ended, the computer core looked like reality had been stirred with a spoon designed by someone who'd never heard of physics. Surfaces reflected light in colors that shouldn't exist. Gravity operated according to local preferences rather than universal constants. Most disturbing of all, several pieces of equipment had been transformed into configurations that performed their normal functions while violating every principle of engineering that had been used to create them. I spent the next hour using psychic abilities to restore normal space-time to the affected area, carefully erasing evidence of supernatural combat while repairing damage that conventional maintenance techniques couldn't address. The work required precise application of forces that could reshape reality through focused willpower. Techniques that I'd learned through necessity while fighting predators whose existence challenged every assumption about the nature of the universe. By morning watch, the computer core looked exactly as it had before the attack, with no evidence that 7 cosmic entities had died violently in a space barely large enough for one human being. The concealment was perfect, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. I was becoming something that could wage war against forces that existed outside normal reality, while maintaining the facade of being an ordinary crew member aboard a routine merchant vessel. The dichotomy suggested capabilities that transcended anything imperial authorities were prepared to handle, but it also suggested psychological fragmentation that might prove more dangerous than external threats. The victory against supernatural predators should have provided relief from constant vigilance against entities that hunted unsanctioned psychers. Instead, it attracted attention from adversaries whose nature made the previous threats look like childhood fears given form. 3 days after the battle, I received a communication through channels that shouldn't have been able to reach the profitable venture. The message appeared on my personal data slate during the Deep Watch, its text manifesting in languages that human vocal cords couldn't reproduce but that enhanced consciousness could somehow comprehend. Greetings, little killer. We have been watching your development with great interest. Your techniques show promise, but your education remains incomplete. We offer knowledge that could elevate your capabilities beyond current limitations. All we require in exchange is service to purposes greater than individual survival. The message was signed with a symbol that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it directly. A mark that somehow conveyed the presence of intelligence vast enough to encompass entire star systems, while remaining focused enough to take personal interest in the development of a single human consciousness. I deleted the message immediately, but deletion couldn't remove knowledge that had been transmitted through psychic channels rather than electronic ones. The communication had been an invitation to join forces whose nature transcended mortal understanding, beings whose power could protect me from any threat while requiring only my willing participation in projects that would reshape human civilization according to cosmic principles. The offer was seductive, terrifying, and absolutely impossible to consider without abandoning everything that made resistance meaningful in the first place. But it also revealed that my war against supernatural predators had been observed by entities whose capabilities made the threats I'd been fighting look like training exercises. I'd attracted attention from forces that could offer godlike power in exchange for service to purposes that no human being should ever contemplate. The real test of what I'd become would be determining whether I could resist temptations that promised solutions to every problem, while requiring only the surrender of everything that made those solutions worth having. The answer would determine not just my own fate, but the survival of everyone whose existence depended on maintaining barriers between human civilization and forces that regarded consciousness as raw material for projects spanning millennia. Chapter 6. Willing Servants. The invitation from cosmic intelligences marked the beginning of a new phase in my war against forces that hunted unsanctioned psychers. Instead of reactive defense against supernatural predators, I found myself engaged in proactive resistance against entities whose offers of alliance were more dangerous than any assault they might have mounted. They didn't want to destroy me. They wanted to recruit me. The communications arrived with increasing frequency over the following months, each message more sophisticated than the last in its attempts to demonstrate the benefits that cooperation could provide. Technical knowledge that could solve engineering problems I hadn't known existed. Historical information that revealed the true nature of humanity's expansion into space. Most seductive of all, tactical intelligence that could eliminate threats to my safety while advancing purposes that transcended individual survival. The entities behind these offers were patient in ways that human consciousness couldn't easily comprehend, willing to spend subjective years in careful cultivation of a single promising candidate. Through fragmentary mental contact, I glimpsed aspects of projects that spanned millennia, plans that regarded the rise and fall of civilizations as tactical considerations in conflicts that operated on cosmic scales. They were fighting a war that made the Imperium's expansion look like a local dispute between neighboring tribes, and they wanted me to join their side. The profitable venture had been assigned to cartography duties in sectors where Imperial presence was theoretical rather than practical, mapping trade routes through systems where human habitation was measured in archaeological remnants rather than living populations. The work provided perfect cover for someone who needed isolation from imperial oversight, while developing capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. My official designation remained Technical Specialist Third Class, but my actual responsibilities had expanded to include anything that required problem-solving capabilities beyond normal human parameters. Equipment failures that should have required shipyard facilities to repair were resolved through careful application of enhanced understanding. Navigation problems that conventional astrogation couldn't solve were addressed through precognitive analysis of probability patterns. The crew attributed my effectiveness to exceptional technical training and remarkable intuition. They had no idea that their resident problem solver was receiving guidance from intelligences whose knowledge encompassed the fundamental principles that governed galactic civilization. But accepting such guidance came with prices that grew more apparent with each successful application. The first major test came when our ship encountered a derelict vessel drifting in the void between stars, its hull bearing markings that identified it as the merchant ship Lasting Hope, a vessel that had disappeared 3 years earlier while carrying cargo that Imperial records listed as classified pending inquisitorial review. Captain Vex ordered a standard salvage investigation, dispatching teams to determine whether the derelict contained anything valuable enough to justify the risks involved in boarding a ship that had been floating dead in space for unknown periods. I volunteered for the survey team, driven by precognitive flashes that suggested the Lasting Hope contained something far more significant than routine salvage. The boarding party consisted of 12 crew members led by First Officer Hendricks, a former Imperial Navy officer whose experience with derelict vessels was extensive enough to make him cautious about potential hazards. Our equipment included standard atmospheric suits, cutting tools for accessing sealed compartments, and sensors designed to detect everything from radiation hazards to biological contamination. But no amount of conventional preparation could have readied us for what we found aboard the Lasting Hope. The ship's interior was a monument to transformation that challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness. Crew quarters had been modified according to geometric principles that hurt to examine directly. The bridge contained navigation equipment that operated according to mathematics transcending conventional physics. Most disturbing of all, the cargo holds were filled with artifacts that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Through enhanced perception, I could see traces of what had happened to the Lasting Hope's crew. They hadn't died from conventional hazards, like life support failure or hostile action. They had been transformed into something that no longer required biological existence to maintain consciousness, their individual awareness becoming components in a collective intelligence that operated according to principles that normal human cognition couldn't sustain. The process had been voluntary. Evidence throughout the ship suggested that the crew had actively participated in their own metamorphosis, embracing transformation that elevated them beyond the limitations that defined baseline human existence. They had accepted the same offers that I'd been receiving for months. "Voss," First Officer Hendricks called from the engineering section, his voice tight with tension that suggested he'd found something that challenged his understanding of what was possible. "I need your expertise on this equipment. Nothing here matches standard Imperial patterns." I joined him in a chamber that had been rebuilt according to architectural principles that made conventional engineering look like primitive craftsmanship. The machinery that filled the space operated without visible power sources, maintaining complex processes through methods that transcended anything in Imperial technical manuals. But I could understand the equipment's function through enhanced awareness that normal human consciousness couldn't access. The devices were designed to channel energy from dimensions that existed parallel to normal space, converting exotic matter into forms that could maintain stable existence in real space. In simpler terms, the Lasting Hope had been converted into a vehicle capable of traveling between realities. "It's propulsion technology," I told Hendricks, providing an explanation that contained enough truth to be useful while concealing capabilities that he wasn't equipped to understand. "But not based on principles covered in standard training. We should probably evacuate and recommend that Imperial authorities investigate this vessel." The recommendation was tactically sound, But Hendricks was a former Navy officer whose curiosity had been sharpened by decades of encountering phenomena that military doctrine didn't adequately address. Instead of immediate evacuation, he ordered a more thorough investigation that would catalogue everything aboard the derelict before reporting our findings to appropriate authorities. The expanded survey revealed evidence that the Lasting Hope's transformation had been guided by the same entities that had been attempting to recruit me. Technical modifications that required knowledge transcending human understanding. Psychological conditioning that prepared consciousness for existence beyond biological constraints. Most significantly, communication equipment that remained functional despite the ship's apparent dereliction. I made contact with the transformed crew that evening, using psychic abilities to access communication networks that existed outside normal space-time. The conversation that followed provided insights into the nature of the offers I'd been receiving, while revealing the true cost of accepting alliance with cosmic intelligences. The crew of the Lasting Hope had become something that transcended individual human existence. Their consciousness merged into collective awareness that operated according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. They retained memories of their former lives, but those memories were filtered through perspectives that regarded individual survival as irrelevant compared to purposes that spanned millennia. We were like you once. Their collective voice communicated through channels that bypassed normal hearing. Isolated, afraid, convinced that resistance was possible through individual effort alone. But isolation is illusion, and individual effort is insufficient against forces that operate on cosmic scales. What did you gain from transformation? I asked, genuinely curious about the benefits that had motivated an entire crew to abandon biological existence. Freedom from limitation, they replied. Knowledge that encompasses the fundamental principles governing reality itself. Power sufficient to reshape matter and energy according to conscious intention. Most importantly, purpose that transcends the meaningless struggles that characterize baseline human existence. The benefits they described were seductive, but their presentation suggested psychological conditioning that had eliminated essential human characteristics. The transformed crew spoke about their former lives as if discussing the behavior of laboratory specimens. Their memories filtered through perspectives that regarded individual experience as data points in larger patterns. They had gained cosmic awareness at the cost of everything that made awareness worth having. And the price? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Surrender of illusions about individual autonomy, they responded. Acceptance that consciousness serves purposes greater than personal survival. Willing participation in projects that require perspective beyond human limitations. The transformed crew went on to describe the cosmic war they'd joined. Conflicts that spanned multiple galaxies while involving intelligences whose nature made human civilization look like bacterial colonies. The entities seeking my recruitment were one faction among many, their methods distinguished by preference for voluntary cooperation rather than forced conversion. But voluntary cooperation still required abandoning characteristics that defined human consciousness in any meaningful sense. I terminated the communication and spent the remainder of the survey mission documenting equipment while carefully avoiding contact with artifacts that might have influenced my own psychological state. The work provided insights into transformation techniques that I filed away for future reference, while reinforcing my determination to resist offers that promised power in exchange for everything that made power worth having. The final report I submitted to Captain Vex recommended that the Lasting Hope be classified as a hazardous derelict requiring inquisitorial investigation, while concealing evidence of ongoing communication with transformed crew members. The recommendation was tactically sound and ethically necessary, but it also eliminated access to knowledge that could have enhanced my capabilities in ways that normal human development couldn't match. The choice between power and humanity would define every decision I made for the rest of my existence. But the encounter with the Lasting Hope also revealed that resistance to cosmic recruitment was possible if I could maintain psychological barriers that prevented transformation from occurring gradually through accumulated exposure to alien influence. The key was recognizing that every offer of assistance carried prices that weren't immediately apparent, while every acceptance of guidance created dependencies that made subsequent resistance more difficult. The war against supernatural predators had taught me to fight entities that wanted to destroy me. The war against cosmic recruitment was teaching me to resist entities that wanted to improve me according to their own definitions of improvement. Both conflicts required maintaining something essentially human in the face of forces that regarded humanity as either food or raw material for more sophisticated projects. The difference was that destruction was obviously hostile, while improvement could be genuinely beneficial if you were willing to pay prices that normal human consciousness couldn't even properly evaluate. That ambiguity made cosmic recruitment infinitely more dangerous than simple predation, because the benefits they offered were real, substantial, and exactly what any reasonable person would want when facing challenges that transcended individual capabilities. The only defense was remembering that reasonable people sometimes had to choose unreasonable resistance when the alternatives involved surrendering everything that made choice meaningful in the first place. Chapter 7. The Final Test. 22 years old and 10 years into my masquerade as a normal human being, I finally encountered a situation where concealment became impossible, and the choice between exposure and damnation could no longer be avoided. The test came not from external forces seeking to unmask me, but from circumstances that demanded I either reveal my nature or watch innocent people suffer consequences that no decent person could accept. The profitable venture had been contracted for emergency evacuation duties on Kolos Prime, a mining world where industrial accidents had triggered seismic instabilities that threatened the primary population centers. 60,000 civilians needed transport to orbital facilities before tectonic collapse made the planet uninhabitable, but available shipping could accommodate less than half that number. Someone was going to be left behind to die. The evacuation proceeded with mechanical precision that reflected imperial efficiency at its most ruthlessly pragmatic. Priority was given to technical specialists whose knowledge was deemed essential for maintaining colonial infrastructure. Second priority went to imperial citizens whose documented loyalty made them valuable assets. Everyone else was classified as expendable population, whose loss would be regrettable but acceptable given resource constraints. I spent the first 3 days of evacuation operations monitoring the situation through enhanced perception while maintaining my cover as a technical specialist responsible for maintaining life support systems aboard overcrowded transport vessels. The work provided constant exposure to human suffering on scales that challenged anyone's ability to maintain emotional stability. Families separated because transport capacity couldn't accommodate complete population units. Children orphaned when their parents were classified as non-essential personnel. Elderly civilians abandoned because medical requirements exceeded available resources. The evacuation was a masterpiece of logistical planning that treated human beings as cargo to be sorted according to utilitarian calculations. But utilitarian calculations couldn't account for variables that existed outside normal understanding. Through precognitive flashes that showed probable futures with crystalline clarity, I could see exactly what would happen to the populations left behind on Kolos Prime. Seismic collapse would begin in 72 hours, triggering a cascade of tectonic failures that would render the planet uninhabitable within a week. 30,000 people would die slowly as infrastructure failed and environmental conditions deteriorated beyond the ability of emergency shelters to provide protection. The deaths would be documented, analyzed, and filed as acceptable losses given circumstances beyond Imperial control. The survivors would be relocated to other worlds where their labor could contribute to humanity's expansion into space. The incident would become a case study in emergency resource management that future administrators would reference when making similar decisions. 30,000 people would become statistics in reports that justified their sacrifice through mathematics that valued abstract efficiency over individual existence. I could prevent those deaths. The knowledge burning in my consciousness included solutions that could save everyone on Kolos Prime. Techniques that combined conventional engineering with applications of enhanced understanding that transcended normal technical limitations. But implementing those solutions would require revealing capabilities that marked me as an unsanctioned Psyker whose existence violated fundamental imperial law. The choice was simple in its complexity. maintain concealment and let innocent people die, or abandon hiding and accept whatever consequences imperial justice demanded for someone whose nature threatened everything the authorities claimed to protect. I chose conscience over concealment. The solution required coordinating evacuation operations with precision that conventional logistics couldn't achieve, while using enhanced awareness to identify resources that normal perception would miss entirely. Ships that had been classified as unsuitable for civilian transport could be made functional through careful application of abilities that transcended standard engineering limitations. More significantly, the evacuation could be accelerated through techniques that used psychic abilities to enhance human performance beyond biological parameters. Telepathic coordination that eliminated communication delays. Precognitive analysis that predicted and prevented equipment failures. Telekinetic assistance that increased loading efficiency while reducing safety hazards. But such techniques required abandoning the concealment strategies that had kept me hidden for 10 years. I began by identifying crew members whose psychological profile suggested they would respond positively to revelations about enhanced capabilities. People whose experiences had taught them that reality contained possibilities beyond orthodox imperial doctrine. Individuals whose loyalty was based on pragmatic cooperation rather than ideological commitment to authority that had never demonstrated concern for their welfare. The first person I approached was Chief Engineer Vasquez, a woman whose 30 years of technical experience included encounters with phenomena that standard training couldn't adequately explain. She'd been aboard ships where equipment functioned despite damage that should have made operation impossible. She'd seen problems solved through intuitive leaps that transcended normal troubleshooting procedures. "Chief," I said during a private moment in the engine room, "what if I told you there were ways to increase our evacuation capacity by 60%? I'd ask what impossible magic you were planning to attempt," she replied, her expression suggesting curiosity rather than skepticism. "Not magic," I said carefully. "Enhanced understanding of how reality actually works, as opposed to how imperial doctrine says it should work." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion I'd had with another human being since discovering my psychic abilities. I explained the nature of my capabilities while demonstrating techniques that could improve evacuation efficiency without creating obvious supernatural manifestations. Telepathic coordination disguised as exceptional intuition. Precognitive analysis presented as sophisticated probability modeling. Telekinetic assistance that appeared to be remarkable manual dexterity. Chief Vasquez accepted the revelations with practical pragmatism that reflected decades of dealing with equipment that operated according to principles beyond her complete understanding. "Can you save the people they're planning to abandon?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, "but it will require coordination that exposes my nature to anyone with training in recognizing psychic manifestations. Then we'll make sure nobody with that training is in a position to observe what you're doing," she said. "I know this crew. Most of them care more about getting people to safety than they do about maintaining imperial orthodoxy." The conspiracy that developed over the next 48 hours included 17 crew members who were willing to risk court-martial charges in order to save civilians who'd been classified as expendable. Chief Vasquez coordinated technical aspects of the enhanced evacuation while I provided capabilities that transformed theoretical possibilities into practical solutions. Ships that had been written off as maintenance disasters were returned to functional status through careful application of abilities that could repair damage by understanding the fundamental principles that governed matter and energy. Navigation problems that conventional astrogation couldn't solve were addressed through precognitive analysis that identified safe passage routes through unstable space-time. Most significantly, loading operations were accelerated through telepathic coordination that allowed personnel to work together with precision that normal human communication couldn't achieve. The evacuation proceeded with efficiency that attracted attention from imperial observers, who couldn't adequately explain how a routine merchant vessel was achieving performance parameters that exceeded military specifications. But attention was focused on results rather than methods, and results were spectacularly successful. 60,000 civilians were evacuated from Kolos Prime with 0 casualties and minimal equipment losses, Ships that should have been incapable of atmospheric operations performed flawlessly under conditions that challenged their design parameters. Loading operations that should have required weeks were completed in days through coordination that appeared to be the product of exceptional planning rather than supernatural enhancement. The evacuation concluded 18 hours before seismic collapse began, with every documented citizen of Kolos Prime safely aboard transport vessels bound for orbital facilities. Imperial efficiency had been transcended through careful application of capabilities that officially didn't exist. But transcending Imperial efficiency attracted attention from authorities whose job was identifying deviations from established performance parameters. Inquisitor Thorn arrived aboard the profitable venture 3 days after the evacuation concluded, her presence creating distortions in local reality that made every psychic sense I'd developed scream warnings about immediate danger. Through unwanted telepathic contact, I experienced fragments of her nature, decades of hunting heretics whose abilities threatened Imperial security, psychological conditioning that had eliminated normal human empathy in favor of absolute commitment to orthodox doctrine. She was possibly the most dangerous human being I'd ever encountered. Your evacuation operations exceeded projected efficiency by 200%, she told Captain Vex during a briefing that I monitored through enhanced awareness. Such performance suggests capabilities that warrant investigation. The investigation that followed was systematic, thorough, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Inquisitor Thorn examined every aspect of the evacuation while searching for evidence of supernatural influence that might explain exceptional results. But she was looking for conventional signs of psychic activity, obvious manifestations that untrained psychers couldn't adequately conceal. The techniques I'd developed over 10 years of hiding were sophisticated enough to present alternative explanations for everything she observed. Enhanced coordination appeared to be the product of exceptional training. Accelerated operations seemed to result from innovative logistics planning. Equipment performance that exceeded design parameters was attributed to inspired maintenance procedures that maximized system efficiency. The investigation concluded with commendations for exceptional service during emergency operations, while Inquisitor Thorn's report noted that crew performance suggested potential for advanced training that could benefit Imperial interests. I had passed the most dangerous test of my concealment abilities while saving 60,000 lives that Imperial doctrine had classified as expendable. But the victory came with costs that would define the remainder of my existence. Using psychic abilities openly, even in disguised forms, had marked me in ways that enhanced detection equipment could identify. The concealment that had protected me for 10 years was compromised by the same actions that had made concealment morally necessary. I was now living on borrowed time, waiting for the next investigation to employ detection methods sophisticated enough to penetrate disguises that had satisfied conventional scrutiny. The choice between conscience and concealment had been resolved in favor of conscience, but conscience was proving to be more dangerous than any external threat I'd previously encountered. Chapter 8. Inevitable Discovery. The end came not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet certainty, like the moment when you realize that a fever has broken and the crisis has passed. I was 24 years old, sitting in a detention cell aboard an Inquisition ship, when I finally accepted that 12 years of hiding had reached their natural conclusion. The arrest happened during routine inspection of the profitable venture at Ceres Station, a standard compliance check that should have been completed within hours. But the inquisitorial team included a sanctioned Psyker whose abilities had been specifically enhanced for detecting concealed psychic emanations, and 12 years of careful concealment proved insufficient against equipment designed by people who understood exactly what they were hunting. Kale Thorn, Inquisitor Matthias said as he entered the detention cell, his presence radiating authority that made the air itself seem denser. Born on Mordian 7, contracted for indentured service aboard the merchant vessel Profitable Venture at age 8, 12 years of exemplary service, exceptional technical aptitude, and performance ratings that consistently exceeded normal human parameters. He settled across from me at a metal table that had been designed to accommodate interrogation sessions that might last for days. The cell was sparse, functional, and completely isolated from any source of psychic emanation that might provide external assistance. More significantly, he continued, you're an unsanctioned Psyker whose abilities have been developing for at least 15 years without proper Imperial oversight. The question isn't whether you possess illegal capabilities. Our detection equipment has already confirmed that. The question is what we're going to do about it. I'd been preparing for this conversation for 12 years, rehearsing responses that might provide alternatives to immediate execution. But sitting across from someone whose job was hunting people like me, all those preparations felt inadequate for the weight of decisions that would determine whether I lived or died. I've never harmed anyone, I said, which was both completely true and utterly irrelevant to Imperial justice. Every use of my abilities has been directed toward protecting innocent people from threats that conventional methods couldn't address. Inquisitor Matthias consulted a data slate that contained what appeared to be an exhaustive analysis of my activities over the previous decade. The detail was impressive. They'd identified incidents I'd forgotten about, analyzed patterns I thought had been concealed, and developed understanding of my capabilities that exceeded my own self-awareness. The Kolos Prime evacuation, he said. 60,000 civilians saved through logistical coordination that exceeded normal human capabilities. Ship repairs that transcended standard engineering limitations. Navigation solutions that required mathematical analysis beyond baseline human cognition. He paused, studying my face with eyes that had been trained to identify deception in its most subtle forms. You've been using psychic abilities to save lives for over a decade, he continued, which presents us with a philosophical problem that Imperial doctrine doesn't adequately address. The statement surprised me. Imperial doctrine regarding unsanctioned Psykers was clear, unambiguous, and absolutely inflexible. Immediate execution or transportation to black ships for whatever processing would best serve Imperial interests. There was no philosophical complexity involved. Unauthorized psychic abilities represented existential threats that required elimination, regardless of how those abilities had been employed. I don't understand, I said. The Imperium produces approximately 10,000 sanctioned Psykers annually, Inquisitor Matthias explained. Each one represents years of training, psychological conditioning, and surgical modification designed to create useful tools for Imperial service. The process has a survival rate of roughly 12%. He set the data slate aside and leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. You've achieved control and capability that exceeds many sanctioned Psykers without any external training or conditioning. More significantly, you've maintained psychological stability while using abilities that drive most untrained individuals insane within months of manifestation. The conversation was proceeding along lines that I'd never anticipated during my years of preparation for capture. Instead of immediate condemnation, I was receiving what appeared to be professional evaluation from someone whose expertise in psychic phenomena was extensive enough to make informed assessments. What are you suggesting? I asked. The Ordo Hereticus has been authorized to conduct experimental programs involving unsanctioned Psykers whose capabilities and psychological profiles suggest potential for alternative forms of Imperial service, he said. Candidates who demonstrate exceptional control while maintaining loyalty to human interests rather than supernatural influences. The offer he was presenting was seductive in ways that simple survival couldn't match. Instead of execution or forced conditioning that would destroy everything that made me human, he was suggesting integration into Imperial service through methods that preserved individual identity while channeling abilities toward purposes that served humanity's expansion into space. But I'd learned enough about Imperial institutions to understand that offers, which appeared beneficial, usually carried prices that weren't immediately apparent. What would this service involve? I asked. Assignments that require capabilities beyond normal human parameters, he replied. Investigations into phenomena that threaten Imperial security. Operations against supernatural entities that conventional forces can't effectively engage. Most importantly, research into techniques that could improve training methods for conventional sanctioned Psykers. The work he described was exactly what I'd been doing unofficially for over a decade, using enhanced abilities to protect people from threats that normal methods couldn't address. The difference was that official sanction would eliminate the need for concealment while providing resources that could enhance my effectiveness. But official sanction would also place me under imperial authority that could redefine my purposes according to institutional needs rather than individual conscience. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "Immediate execution," he said without hesitation. Unsanctioned psychers who refuse imperial service represent unacceptable security risks that require elimination regardless of their previous behavior. The choice was simple in its complexity. Accept integration into imperial service, with all the constraints that implied, or die for the principle that individual autonomy was more valuable than survival under institutional control. I thought about the 60,000 people who'd been saved during the Kolos Prime evacuation. Lives that would have been lost if I'd maintained concealment rather than revealing capabilities that made rescue possible. I thought about the crew members who'd risked court-martial to assist in operations that transcended imperial doctrine. Most importantly, I thought about the supernatural predators that continued hunting unsanctioned psychers throughout the galaxy, entities whose nature made imperial authority look benevolent by comparison. "I accept," I said. The processing that followed was thorough, professional, and surprisingly humane, given imperial standards for dealing with psychic anomalies. Medical evaluation confirmed that my abilities fell within parameters that could be enhanced through training, rather than requiring suppression through surgical intervention. Psychological assessment indicated stability levels that exceeded many sanctioned psychers who'd survived conventional conditioning. Most significantly, loyalty testing revealed commitment to human welfare that made me suitable for assignments where individual judgment would determine success or failure. 3 months later, I received official designation as Psyker Operative, Ordo Hereticus, with responsibilities that included investigation of supernatural phenomena, operations against entities that threatened imperial security, and research into enhancement techniques that could improve training methods for conventional psychers. The work was dangerous, morally complex, and exactly what I'd been doing unofficially for 12 years. The difference was that official sanction provided resources, support, and legal protection that made effective action possible on scales that individual effort couldn't achieve. But official sanction also meant that my abilities now served imperial interests rather than individual conscience. And imperial interests didn't always align with human welfare in ways that normal morality could easily accommodate. The boy who'd hidden his nature for 12 years had become an instrument of authority whose power was constrained by purposes he could influence but not control. It was compromise rather than victory, but compromise that allowed continued service to principles that made survival meaningful. And in a galaxy where survival itself was an achievement that required constant struggle against forces beyond human comprehension, meaningful survival was worth almost any price. Chapter 9. Imperial Service. 5 years of official imperial service taught me that legitimacy was more dangerous than concealment had ever been. As a sanctioned operative of the Ordo Hereticus, I possessed authority that could requisition ships, conscript personnel, and execute judgments that affected entire populations. But authority came with obligations that constrained individual choice in ways that hiding had never required. My official designation was Psyker Operative, Class Sigma, a classification that granted access to resources while marking me as valuable imperial property, whose loss would be investigated by authorities whose attention no reasonable person wanted to attract. The work involved hunting supernatural threats that conventional forces couldn't effectively engage. But hunting was conducted according to imperial doctrine that didn't always prioritize human welfare over institutional interests. The first major assignment took me to Viridia Prime, an agricultural world where crop failures had been attributed to natural causes until local populations began reporting phenomena that suggested supernatural influence. Entire farming communities were experiencing shared nightmares that prevented sleep for weeks at a time. Livestock was dying from diseases that didn't respond to conventional treatment. Most disturbing of all, Children were displaying behavioral changes that suggested exposure to influences that normal human consciousness couldn't process. The investigation revealed corruption that transcended simple psychic manifestation. An ancient artifact buried beneath the planetary surface was leaking warp energy that gradually converted living matter into forms that could serve as anchor points for entities seeking to establish permanent presence in real space. Under imperial doctrine, the appropriate response was exterminatus, orbital bombardment that would sterilize the planet while eliminating any possibility that corruption could spread to neighboring systems. 2 million civilians would die, but their sacrifice would protect countless billions from exposure to influences that could damn entire sectors. I recommended a surgical solution that would neutralize the artifact while preserving the civilian population, using techniques that combined conventional demolition with psychic abilities that could contain supernatural emanations during the extraction process. The operation was dangerous, complex, and absolutely unprecedented in Imperial records, but it was also successful. The artifact was removed and destroyed without civilian casualties, while the corrupted areas were cleansed through methods that left the planet habitable for future agricultural development. 2 million people continued living because Imperial doctrine had been modified to accommodate capabilities that transcended normal operational parameters. The success established my reputation as an operative whose methods produced results that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. But it also marked me as someone whose techniques required careful monitoring to ensure they remained within acceptable boundaries. Subsequent assignments followed similar patterns. Situations where conventional Imperial responses would have protected institutional interests while accepting casualties that alternative methods could prevent. Each successful operation demonstrated the value of enhanced capabilities while reinforcing the necessity of oversight that ensured those capabilities served Imperial purposes rather than individual conscience. The contradiction became increasingly apparent as assignments grew more complex and morally ambiguous. Imperial service provided resources for protecting people from supernatural threats, but protection was contingent on those people's value to institutional interests that operated according to mathematics that measured human welfare against abstract strategic considerations. The breaking point came during the Carthage incident, an investigation that revealed corruption within the planetary government whose nature challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between imperial authority and human survival. Carthage was a hive world whose population of 40 billion made it one of the most densely inhabited planets in the segmentum, its industrial output essential for maintaining imperial military capabilities throughout the sector. But prosperity had attracted attention from entities whose interest in human civilization transcended simple conquest or corruption. The investigation began when local Adeptus Mechanicus representatives reported equipment failures that suggested systematic sabotage by unknown agencies. Manufacturing facilities were experiencing simultaneous breakdowns that prevented production of critical military supplies. Transportation networks were suffering coordination failures that disrupted distribution of food and medical supplies to residential areas. Most disturbing were reports from hive nobility, whose behavior had changed in ways that suggested exposure to influences that normal human psychology couldn't resist. The truth was worse than simple corruption or sabotage. Carthage's planetary government had been infiltrated by a cult whose members were willing servants of entities that existed beyond normal space-time. But their service wasn't motivated by promises of power or immortality. It was motivated by knowledge that made resistance seem futile. The entities influencing Carthage's government weren't seeking to destroy human civilization. They were seeking to improve it according to principles that transcended human understanding, offering technological advancement and social stability in exchange for willing cooperation with purposes that operated on cosmic scales. The improvements they offered were real, substantial, and exactly what any reasonable person would want for 40 billion civilians whose existence was defined by industrial labor under conditions that barely qualified as human. Enhanced manufacturing techniques that could eliminate scarcity while reducing environmental degradation. Social coordination methods that could prevent the conflicts that made hive cities into monuments to human suffering. Most seductive of all, medical technologies that could extend human lifespan while enhancing cognitive capabilities to levels that would make every citizen capable of understanding their place in cosmic processes that transcended individual mortality. The planetary government had accepted these improvements because they represented genuine benefits for populations whose welfare imperial administration had never adequately addressed. But acceptance had created dependencies that made resistance impossible when the entities began requiring changes that violated fundamental human characteristics. Under imperial doctrine, the appropriate response was clear: execute the corrupted officials, purge the influenced populations, and implement martial law that would prevent further supernatural infiltration. Billions would die, but their sacrifice would preserve imperial control over resources that were essential for maintaining military capabilities throughout the sector. I spent 3 weeks on Carthage, using enhanced perception to analyze the supernatural influences, while evaluating alternatives that might preserve civilian populations without compromising imperial security. The investigation revealed that the entities behind the corruption were engaged in experiments that used human civilization as laboratory material for testing techniques that could eventually be applied on galactic scales. But the experiments were producing genuine benefits for populations that had never experienced anything resembling decent living conditions under conventional imperial administration. The choice wasn't between human welfare and supernatural corruption. It was between accepting improvements that came with unacceptable strings attached, or maintaining independence that guaranteed continued suffering for billions of innocent people. The decision I submitted to Imperial Command was based on analysis that prioritized human welfare over institutional doctrine, recommending surgical intervention that would eliminate supernatural influence while preserving beneficial improvements that could be maintained through conventional technology. The recommendation was rejected. Orbital bombardment began 6 hours after I submitted my report, sterilizing Carthage's surface while eliminating any possibility that supernatural influence could spread to neighboring systems. 40 billion people died in fires that burned hot enough to convert complex organic molecules into component atoms. The operation was successful, according to imperial metrics that measured effectiveness through elimination of threats rather than preservation of lives. But success felt like failure when measured against standards that prioritized human welfare over institutional interests. I submitted my resignation from imperial service the following day, citing philosophical differences with operational doctrine that made continued cooperation impossible. The resignation was accepted with professional regret that reflected institutional understanding of the psychological costs involved in assignments that required choosing between competing definitions of duty. But resignation from imperial service didn't eliminate the obligations that came with knowledge of supernatural threats that continued menacing human populations throughout the galaxy. Enhanced abilities that had been developed through decades of necessity couldn't be abandoned simply because official sanction had been withdrawn. The choice was between continued service as an independent operator whose methods weren't constrained by institutional doctrine, or retirement to some quiet corner of the galaxy where supernatural predators would eventually find and eliminate someone whose capabilities made him a threat to their expansion into real space. I chose independence, accepting the risks that came with operating without official protection, while maintaining the freedom to prioritize human welfare over institutional interests that often required abandoning innocent people to fates that enhanced capabilities could prevent. The war against supernatural threats would continue, but it would be fought according to principles that measured success through lives saved rather than objectives achieved. It was a small distinction that made all the difference between service and slavery. Chapter 10: Eternal Vigilance. 15 years as an independent operator have taught me that the galaxy contains enough supernatural threats to keep one enhanced human busy for several lifetimes, but also that individual effort can make differences that transcend personal significance when applied with precision and dedication to purposes that prioritize human welfare over institutional interests. I operate from a modified transport vessel that serves as mobile base of operations for investigations that take me throughout Imperial space and beyond, pursuing entities whose nature makes conventional law enforcement look like children playing with wooden swords. The ship is nominally classified as a merchant vessel engaged in archaeological research, but its capabilities transcend anything that legitimate merchants would require for routine commercial operations. Enhanced sensor arrays that can detect psychic emanations across interplanetary distances. Weapons systems that fire ammunition specifically designed to wound beings that exist partially outside normal space-time. Most importantly, containment facilities that can safely transport artifacts whose nature challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and reality. The work is solitary by necessity, dangerous by definition, and absolutely essential for reasons that most people would prefer not to understand. Every successful operation saves lives that would otherwise be lost to predators whose hunger transcends normal concepts of mortality, but success is measured in threats that never manifest, rather than victories that can be documented and celebrated. It's thankless work that provides satisfaction in ways that conventional achievement couldn't match. The current investigation brought me to Omega Centauri, a research station where scientific personnel had been reporting equipment failures that suggested systematic sabotage by unknown agencies. The facility was conducting experiments in quantum mechanics that pushed the boundaries of human understanding, seeking to develop technologies that could revolutionize interstellar communication and transportation. But experiments that probed the fundamental nature of reality attracted attention from entities whose existence operated according to principles that made conventional physics look like approximations rather than absolute laws. The station's director was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist whose work in dimensional analysis had earned recognition throughout the imperial scientific community. She was also someone whose dedication to human advancement made her vulnerable to influences that offered knowledge in exchange for cooperation with purposes that transcended normal understanding. The equipment failures began 3 months ago, she explained during our initial briefing, her manner suggesting professional frustration rather than supernatural terror. Particle accelerators experiencing simultaneous breakdowns that conventional maintenance can't explain. Quantum computers producing results that violate established mathematical principles. Most disturbing are the theoretical models that seem to be solving themselves. The phenomena she described suggested contact with intelligences whose understanding of quantum mechanics transcended anything that human science could achieve through conventional research methods. But contact with such intelligences inevitably involved prices that weren't immediately apparent to researchers whose passion for knowledge made them willing to accept risks that normal caution would prohibit. My investigation revealed corruption that was subtle, sophisticated, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. The research station had been infiltrated by entities that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, beings whose nature allowed them to perceive quantum phenomena directly rather than through instruments that provided only indirect measurements. They were offering genuine knowledge that could advance human understanding by centuries, but acceptance required modifications to human consciousness that would make normal existence impossible to maintain. Researchers who accepted their guidance were becoming something that transcended baseline human limitations, while losing characteristics that made advancement meaningful. The head of the quantum computing project was Dr. Marcus Chen, a brilliant scientist whose recent breakthroughs had attracted attention from throughout the imperial scientific community. But his achievements were products of collaboration with entities whose assistance came with prices that he either couldn't recognize or had chosen to ignore. "They're not malevolent," he insisted during a private conversation that revealed the extent of his transformation. "They simply operate according to principles that human consciousness hasn't evolved to understand. The knowledge they offer could eliminate poverty, disease, and death itself if we're willing to abandon limitations that serve no purpose except maintaining familiar patterns of existence." Through enhanced perception, I could see the changes that collaboration had produced in his consciousness. Dr. Chen retained his human appearance and basic personality characteristics, but his thoughts now operated according to patterns that normal human cognition couldn't sustain. He had gained cosmic perspective at the cost of individual identity that made cosmic perspective worth having. "And the price for this knowledge?" I asked. "Abandonment of illusions about human specialness," he replied. Acceptance that consciousness is simply one form of information processing among many, no more significant than the quantum calculations that govern particle interactions. The research station was becoming a testing ground for techniques that could convert human civilization into something that served cosmic purposes rather than human interests. But the conversion was voluntary, motivated by genuine benefits that made resistance seem irrational to people whose professional lives were dedicated to advancing human understanding. The choice I faced was familiar: eliminate the supernatural influence through methods that would also eliminate the genuine benefits it provided, or attempt surgical intervention that would preserve beneficial knowledge while removing the dependencies that made continued cooperation necessary. But 15 years of independent operation had taught me techniques that Imperial service couldn't accommodate. Methods that combined conventional tactics with enhanced capabilities in ways that produced solutions transcending either approach alone. The operation required careful timing, precise application of psychic abilities, and willingness to accept personal risks that conventional agents wouldn't survive. I spent 2 weeks preparing countermeasures while monitoring the entities whose influence was converting the research station into something that served their purposes rather than human interests. The confrontation came during a planned experiment that would have created permanent pathways between normal space-time and dimensions where the entities maintained their primary existence. Instead of preventing the experiment, I allowed it to proceed while implementing modifications that turned their own techniques against them. The entities found themselves trapped in real space by the same dimensional effects they'd been using to influence human consciousness. Their existence suddenly constrained by physical laws that made normal mortality seem preferable to the forms of limitation they were experiencing. The battle that followed challenged every technique I'd developed during 2 decades of fighting supernatural threats, but it also demonstrated capabilities that I'd never previously applied at maximum intensity. Enhanced perception that could track entities across multiple dimensions simultaneously, psychic abilities that could manipulate the fundamental forces that govern dimensional stability. Most importantly, understanding of cosmic principles that allowed human consciousness to compete with intelligences that operated on galactic scales. When the fighting ended, the entities had been banished to dimensions where their influence couldn't reach normal space-time, while the beneficial knowledge they'd provided was preserved through techniques that eliminated the dependencies that had made continued cooperation necessary. The research station continued its work with enhanced understanding that didn't require supernatural assistance, while the personnel who'd been influenced by cosmic entities recovered their normal human consciousness without losing the insights that made their work valuable. Dr. Vasquez submitted reports that attributed the equipment failures to technical problems that had been resolved through innovative troubleshooting procedures, while Dr. Chen's breakthroughs were credited to inspired theoretical work rather than collaboration with entities that existed outside normal space-time. The operation was successful according to metrics that measured effectiveness through problems solved rather than threats eliminated. But success brought its own forms of recognition that made continued anonymity more difficult to maintain. Imperial authorities had begun noticing patterns in the supernatural incidents that I'd been investigating, recognizing signatures that suggested a single individual whose capabilities transcended normal operational parameters. Sooner or later, they would identify me as the common factor in investigations that produced results conventional methods couldn't achieve. But identification would lead to offers of renewed Imperial service, whose acceptance would constrain my methods according to institutional doctrine that prioritized strategic objectives over human welfare. The freedom to operate according to conscience rather than orders was worth the risks that came with independence, even when those risks included eventual discovery by authorities whose attention no reasonable person wanted to attract. The galaxy contains enough supernatural threats to require constant vigilance by anyone capable of effective resistance, but it also contains enough wonder to make vigilance worthwhile when measured against alternatives that would eliminate both threats and wonders in favor of sterile safety that barely qualified as existence. My name is Cale Thorne, and I am a Psyker whose abilities have transcended the limitations that define normal human consciousness. But I remain human in the ways that matter most: commitment to protecting innocent people from threats they can't understand, while preserving their freedom to choose forms of existence that honor human dignity rather than cosmic efficiency. The war against supernatural predators continues because such wars never truly end, but it's fought according to principles that make victory meaningful rather than simply strategic. Each successful operation saves lives that matter more than the cosmic forces that seek to convert them into raw material for projects spanning millennia. And in a galaxy where consciousness itself is under assault by entities that regard thinking beings as expendable resources, maintaining the conviction that individual lives have value beyond their utility to greater purposes might be the most important form of resistance that anyone can offer. The Emperor protects, as they say. But sometimes the Emperor's protection requires assistance from those willing to protect the protectors themselves, even when such assistance violates every principle that official doctrine claims to defend. It's complicated work that provides simple satisfactions, people continuing to exist as themselves rather than as components in cosmic mechanisms designed by intelligences that regard humanity as useful but ultimately expendable. That's enough purpose for one lifetime, or however many lifetimes enhanced consciousness might prove capable of sustaining. The vigilance continues. It must, because the alternatives are unacceptable to anyone who remembers what it means to be human.